So this is the first week of what we're calling, I don't know, holy days or sacred days or something like that. Again, it was as I was thinking about a 4 week series and approaching Holy Week, and as I said, I shared on Sunday that my week, my Lent has been such in a wonky way. Um, just we went to Ash Wednesday in Columbus, and it didn't felt like Ash Wednesday, but it just felt weird. I felt distant. I felt far. And so as I started pondering about what we might teach about or talk about, just I thought, you know what? Sometimes we take things for granted, and we have these holy days that exist in our calendar, but we don't actually explore what they mean. So today we'll start with Palm Sunday. Next week we'll do Maundy Thursday, and I'll highlight some of the aspects that I've placed around the meal of remembrance that we'll do and how that sort of touches upon the story of the Last Supper. The following week, when I'm in Austin, we'll all be online, and we'll do Good Friday, and the history and theology of that, and then the last week when I'm back here during Holy Week on that Wednesday, we'll have a session during Holy Week where we look at Easter or the Resurrection Day and ask what that is. And the whole hope of it is as we enter into each one of those days into Holy Week, that the perspective of what we're learning or thinking about today will sort of feed into the intentionality of it, your own recognition of the symbols and some of the theology behind it. So today like I said, we're starting on Palm Sunday. This year, for those of you who are with us, we have talked about, we have always had palms here at church. Palm Sunday, my earliest memory of Palm Sunday was having palms. I don't remember, we celebrated it in the assembly. We didn't really celebrate it in the Assemblies of God other than acknowledging the story of Jesus and the palms. I have this faint memory of palms in the Methodist Church, but there was a long time that I just didn't really have them. And it really wasn't in the Presbyterian church that I was at in Chicago. We did palms, and they had them, and they were just reeds, and we waved them during a certain song, or we threw them down in the aisle. But it really wasn't until when I was in seminary. During my Master's of Divinity, I was the seminary assistant to the Princeton University Chapel, which was led by an Episcopalian priest. And so it was the first time I really sort of encountered and really began thinking about the theology behind it, because they had this ritual where you would go inside the sanctuary, or the narthex at the sanctuary, you would get a reed or a palm, you would get some liturgy, and then we would go back outside. And we would start on, and when I say the Princeton University Chapel, it really was like, you have to imagine a medieval or English cathedral. It was just massive, and had several 100 or something feet down. It was huge and ornate wood, and it was huge stone structure, very Gothic. But we would start, and there would be a liturgist in a tower that sat above and would read something, and we would respond, Hosanna in the highest, and then we would have a song, and we would walk around this entire huge cathedral and then make our way into the sanctuary singing these hosannas. And I remember just at the time thinking, like, this is a lot of pomp and circumstance around Jesus's entry into Jerusalem, or for Palm Sunday. And it got me thinking, and at a time where I was thinking more about what liturgy meant and the value of it in the Presbyterian churches in particular. And so I have since developed a deeper appreciation for it, a love for it even. I think it is one of the season of Lent. We'll talk a little bit about that, but the season of Lent in general spans for us for Ash Wednesday to Easter, and so all the way through Palm Sunday. And it's meant to be 40 days of fasting, but the Sundays are meant to not be fasted upon. So in some traditions, you could, if you give up coffee for Lent or something, on Sundays, people could have coffee, because Sundays are meant to be a little Sabbath. And so you're never meant to fast on the Sabbath, because every Sunday we're celebrating the resurrection of God. So you're not meant to fast on Sundays. So if you follow the looser, the hardcore Catholics, not like Jim, but the hardcore Catholics who do this, they'll fast through the whole thing. And then but the lax Catholics, they like to cheat on Sundays, and I like to also cheat on Sundays. And so whatever I begin for Lent, I'm always like, Sundays are around, it's time to celebrate. but it's meant to lead up to a place where through and as we talk about the history of it, lead us the whole season is meant to lead us up to a place of celebration, but Palm Sunday in particular has an event attached to it of Jesus's triumphant entry into Jerusalem. And there was a shift in history where it went from these massive, almost over celebratory festivals throughout all of Europe. Throughout, if you can go on and if you type in global Palm Sunday practices or Palm Sunday celebrations, you'll see in countries around the world there's flowers, there's processions, there's singing, hosannas, there's palm leaves. It's colorful. It's meant to be joyous. And it was really in the last century, as the Roman Catholics tightened down on some of the things around Second Vatican Council, that they turned it away from the celebratory aspects of what traditionally had been celebrated for over 1,000 years in a more festive way into a more solemn event. So if you go to a Catholic church operating in a post pre-Vatican or Vatican II, what you'll get is instead of Palm Sunday, it'll be Passion Sunday, which we also borrow some of the colors from. We change. I'll talk about that in a second. Our colors to red. It's one of the few Sundays outside of Pentecost that you can actually put red on in terms of the colors that we put up, and it's meant to both. If it was about royalty, it would be purple, but red is really meant to turn us towards the death and the blood, and it's meant to represent that red blood. And so today, what I hope to do is I want to talk just a little bit about the day as a whole, and some broader celebrations or how it's looked at today. And you can kind of divide that into basically almost three large camps. I want to talk about the biblical basis or the biblical references that go on, and they come from Zechariah and Psalms. And then in the New Testament, we'll talk about where it's at in the New Testament in the four passages that it's listed, or the four Gospels, and how they portray it a little bit differently, and then also the historical procession of how it came to being, and then some of the theological and practical aspects about how we celebrate it. So we'll just, like we do anything, we'll move through it sort of systematically. So if anyone has any questions or thoughts, feel free to interject. It's called Passion Sunday. It's called Palm Sunday. It's called the Entry of the Lord into Jerusalem Sunday. Depending on whatever tradition you are, you're going to find a different name for it. Some call it just the sixth Sunday of Lent. But it's always meant to point us towards the beginning of Holy Week. So it's always considered the first day of the Holy Week. So Holy Week doesn't start on Monday. It starts on Palm Sunday. And there's meant to be almost, for Presbyterians, it's usually looked at as a transition point. So like I said, we celebrate Sabbaths. We don't fast on that day. So Palm Sunday is meant to be almost this day of celebration, a mini celebration before hardcore last week, down to the last week, a Holy Week, where you have meant to have a lot of reflection in that. And because of that, in the Protestant church, you'll get, in any Protestant church you go into, you'll get palms and waving and hosannas, and then not immediately after that. Some people have festivals or feasts after that, but after that evening, as nightfall comes into play, then the idea is that you're turning towards the darkness of Passion Week, in part, which is why over the last few years here we've showed the Passion of Christ. To sort of just shift us from that celebratory notion of Palm Sunday into the Passion of the Holy Week. For all intents and purposes, it is a Sunday that is meant to commemorate what is called Jesus's triumphant entry into Jerusalem. It's one of the few events that actually are listed in all four Gospels. And when you find those places where in four Gospels you have stories listed in all of them, they tend to, in terms of the history of theology or liturgical practices, those things tend to rise because of the fact that they are noted in all of them. Naturally, yeah.
When did they start celebrating the Passion Week? Do you know, with a time frame in the church?
The Holy Week as a whole?
Yes.
I mean, you can date back, you can go back to the 4th century for some of these things, and it really depends on where you look. In the Eastern Church, as I talk about, there's some different celebrations there. In the Western Church, really to the late 4th century, you see the beginning of the development of these practices. In
Okay.
the eighth century, in the seventh and eighth, and remember, just in terms of church history, in the late fourth century, you have the legalization and the sanctioning, and then the declaration that the Roman Empire is the Holy Roman Empire, and that's when you see Christmas, and you start to see holy days and rituals developed around the events of Christ's life. Um, um, so you'll see various points in various places in history and in various countries, different emphases on what's happening. And even to the sense in the last century, as much as in the last century, in the 60s or 70s or whatever the dates were, in the 55 to 69, in the midst of the Roman Catholic Reformation of the last century, you also have sort of the development of a lot of non-denominational churches or evangelical churches that don't, like, they completely ignore like the day altogether. In other words, it may be like, oh, it's Palm Sunday, but they don't have any palms. You go to a non-denom church, and it probably, and some of them, I would venture to say a lot of them won't even mention it. In fact, they won't even mention Holy Week. It'll be good. They'll be like, this coming week is Good Friday and Easter. And there's not a sense of Maundy Thursday. There's not a sense of that journey through the whole week. And so but if you're from a mainline denomination, a liturgical denomination, you're going to get some variation of these things, but you can identify them all the way back to the fourth century. And again, depending on the tradition. The Orthodox Church has a much more elaborate ritual for Lent as a whole, and therefore the week leading up to Holy Week becomes this huge thing. And like if you Pasch which is Easter in Eastern Orthodox churches is a huge event. It's like, and when you prepare for, I mean, it's like this giant, almost think of it as have you ever been to a Greek festival or Greek Orthodox, church? For anyone? No one's ever been to a Greek Orthodox church? So sometime, usually in the late spring, early summer, they do these, or in the summers they do Greek festivals at Greek churches. No, no one, anyone?
Yeah, I have.
If you haven't, you should. One of my big regrets about Lake City, as I'm coming back from the city, is that we don't have fish fries on Friday. That's one of the best things about Lent, is on Fridays Catholic churches do fish fries, and it's always a great meal, because who doesn't like fried fish? And you're giving money to a church to support their ministry, so you can eat a lot of fried fish and chips on Friday. We went to one, but it was snowy in Columbus when we went to the first Sunday, and they didn't get a good turnout. So I think the fish was a little left over. I think they cooked too much. So, but but the fish fries on Fridays in cities are, if you've never been to one, they're phenomenal. There's a whole, you go and you type any city, type Chicago, and there are people who go around to different churches and review their fish fries, and they're all fundraisers. But because on Fridays in Catholic traditions you're meatless, and that's emphasized on Friday, it's providing a sort of tradition or a practice. It's fun. I enjoy it. I miss that. I wish St. Rose needs to step up.
Packers has fish and chips on Friday.
Yeah, it's not the same though. It's not the same. It doesn't feel sacramental.
Bring it in here.
There you go. I know. I said I'm gonna get St. Rose to do it one of these years. I'm gonna compel them to. But it's usually a fundraiser, and the whole church comes together, and it's kind of like a Greek festival in the same way Greeks all come together and they do dancing and celebration around but all that goes back to the celebration around Holy Week for Greeks is pretty big, and you can include Palm Sunday in that, although many of them don't actually participate in the feasting of the Sundays, but actually sort of plow through. As I said, the color red represents blood sacrifice, and the idea is Christ is coming into Jerusalem with the knowledge that this is it's kind of like it's his last time going into the city. He knows that this is going to lead to his death. Dead man walking sort of image of that's where he's going, and he's going to die. And so the color red represents that. So it is appropriate on Palm Sunday in a few weeks to wear red, as it is on Pentecost. The biggest shift, what we're going to talk mostly about today, will be Western traditions, but the Eastern traditions, and again, I said the biggest difference is the one they call it just straight up what it is, the entry of the Lord into Jerusalem Sunday. So they can get creative with the names. And there's not as much of an emphasis probably on palms in that regard. But for their tradition, for the Eastern Orthodox Church, for the Orthodox Church as a whole, where we begin Lent on Ash Wednesday, they begin it on Clean Monday, and that's sort of they start 2 days before us, and then they have a pretty strict season of fasting, and it's meant to go 7 weeks before the Resurrection Sunday, which coincides with ours, and the fasting then ends on Friday. In preparation, because Saturday would be sort of the vigil of Easter. So it's kind of like the fasting ends, and then Saturday they're going to eventually, start to
Where
feast.
did they come up with the term Clean Monday? What does that represent? I don't understand.
Getting clean, kind of clean eating. Oftentimes it means no more meat.
Okay.
I mean, for us, Shrove Tuesday, Repentance Tuesday, Fat Tuesday, Pancake Tuesday. People have pancakes because historically you were getting rid of the fat because you were about to enter into a season where you wouldn't use fat in your cooking.
Oh.
And so that's why in the past we've had, we do in our own home, Shrove Tuesday, the day before Ash Wednesday, we always have, and it's not like a big celebration, but it is meant to be like the end of Mardi Gras. Mardi Gras is the week or 2 weeks leading up to Ash Wednesday in the Western Church that leads, and it's personified by partying because you're entering into a season of fasting. We don't often do these things as much in the Protestant church. We embrace some of the celebration of Mardi Gras, but we don't often embrace the giving up of something or the extreme fasting. But in the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Orthodox Church as a whole, fasting is a far more serious business. And so they will recognize the Saturday before Palm Sunday as Lazarus Saturday. And because that's meant to be the last thing that Christ did before he went into Jerusalem. And so there's a reference to that. And then they go on to celebrate Palm Sunday, still in a somewhat subdued way. And then they lead up to, again, that Saturday before where they have the vigil. And that's when, all the party unleashes. And I've never been to a Pasch at an Orthodox church, but one of these years, I'd like to jump in and see how they actually celebrated it in person rather than just by reference. Why don't I? So I guess the best way to do it. Let me do it chronologically, which would then sort of start us. I'm going to combine actually my biblical and historic notes into one. You really don't have. So a couple of things, and we'll talk about the significance of palms, both theologically in a moment, but palms have a unique place in Scripture that bring it to the present, although only John mentions the leaves as being palms. The other synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, listed as rushes. So it doesn't have to be palms. The idea behind it is though when someone of royalty or the kings, or that there would be cloaks thrown on the ground, and that king or that ruler would come in, and as a part of creating this path for them, palms are thrown out. So if you look at it historically, in terms of even prior to where do I have that? You have the background of Egyptians used palms, interestingly enough, for funeral processions. So a little bit different, but perhaps foreshadowing. Is that intended? Did Paul understand that, or John understand that when John wrote about that? I don't know if he understood that, or that was a part of it because he would have influenced highly by Greco-Roman culture, but in Egyptian culture, which does influence Hebrew thinking, naturally after 400 years, it's somewhat supplanted in there, but it also represents palms represent eternal life in Egyptian sort of symbolism. So you have both a funeral provision in the procession and also representation of our eternal life, and then that influences the Hebrew understanding, which if you go back, and this is where if you go to Zechariah, and Psalms are a little bit was where you get the Hosanna and the highest, but if you go to Zechariah, I should have typed these in beforehand, but do you want to look at, I'll have you look up a longer verse, but Zechariah, its passages 9:9. And it says, "Rejoice greatly, daughter of Zion. Shout, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, thy king cometh unto thee. He is just, having salvation, lowly, and riding upon an ass, and upon the colt of the foal of an ass. And so what you have is you have this reference in the book of Zechariah that and that was meant to portray the coming of a king, but not the coming of a king that is characterized by a war horse. So whenever you have an image in history, in particular Jewish history, or even in ancient Near East, if you have a leader or a figure on a horse, it's meant to represent power and strength and preparation for battle. Whereas depicted on many of the ancient Near East ideology, sort of in both in symbolism and in pictures, you have a donkey, which represents the humility. So you have this entry into this idea of this donkey, and they would, as a king comes in, they would lay down, but the donkey or the ass represent peace. And so if a king were to come to a foreign nation and not want to declare war, they would put them on a donkey or a colt, not because it was any less majestic, he was still being carried, but because they were coming almost like a white flag with a sign of waving a white flag saying, I'm not here to cause any problems or start a war. And if you look back at the biblical part of Zechariah, the book of Zechariah was written probably around 515 BC. And this was around the time of the return from the exile from Persia, from Susa, back into Jerusalem. So imagine again the Jews exiled, and when they returned, they sent Ezra and Nehemiah, and they were trying to reestablish Jewish identity. This is where the book of Job comes out of. This is where the book of Esther comes out of. It was like, hey, you've been influenced by the Egyptians and the Assyrians and the Babylonians, and now the Persians. And as you return to Jerusalem, we want you to have an identity that centers around who you are as Jews. And so because they were rebuilding the temple, the entire book of Zechariah is very temple focused. Now, when you think about the fact where Jesus was actually going and he was entering into the temple, and one of the first places he went to in the temple, and when I talked about on Sunday, that sense of presence of God, you get the connection between the idea of a donkey bringing a king into a temple, and a donkey in the New Testament bringing the king to the temple. But what is expected is in one narrative that the king will reign in peace, but what happens is the king offers his life in peace and unto death, which brings peace among the world. So in Zechariah, you have the rededication of the temple. It has a very peaceful view of the Messiah. And really it's intended to stir up hope that the lives that they live, and then they were returning by King Cyrus's order, and they were feeling a sense of settledness, and so it was meant to really reestablish them and to try to say, hey, this image of who the Messiah is not one of battle against another nation, but one of peace. And so the idea was, hey, maybe we're moving into a great time of peace. Now, it was a great time of silence, and there was all sorts of things that happened as the Roman Empire moved in and began to subjugate the Jews again. But at the same time, that image was still meant to last. The second biblical reference we have in all of this is Psalm 118, 25 through 26, which says, Lord, save us. Lord, grant us success. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, or Hosanna, Hosanna. From the house of the Lord we bless you. And in different versions, it listed in different language and different expressions. But when we sing on Palm Sunday, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, this is a reference to that Psalm reference in 118. And in both of these, with the donkey and with the palms and with the procession, it does two things. One, it what fulfills what Jews believe, or Jewish Christians believe, that is the prophecy of the king coming. that was prophesied in Zechariah. But it also then ushers in a time of peace, and it sort of is this paradox of Christ coming in a triumphant, peaceful way, but also leading to a time of suffering. Then you have obviously the 400 years of silence that lead into the intertestamental period, and then for a long time nothing's happening. So then Christ comes on the scene. He lives in life and ministry, and it should note that this is often called his triumphant entry, and what that means is you see Christ. If you want to plot Christ's life on a timeline in the sense of or a story or a plot line, you'll see his birth. It's mysterious birth. And then there's the origin story is hidden, and then he finally shows up and gets baptized and gets his superpowers, and then he goes off in the wilderness as preparation for ministry. He comes out, he starts doing miracles. He's proclaiming who he is. There's suspicion of who he is, but as he's healing people, as he's meeting people, his popularity is growing. He faces conflict along the way, so you have tension. But towards the end, you start to see this rise, not just because Jesus is healing people, but because people are starting to believe that he is the Messiah. And you see this rise up to this point where in Palm Sunday, he enters into Jerusalem, and this is meant to be the height of his earthly existence. And I like the way the other synoptic gospels have it. Then he goes in and he clears the temple, and I like that image of the preparation for what's about to come. John doesn't do that, but the idea that he goes into this situation where he, I guess in the synoptic gospels, you would have the height of his popularity and his clearing of the temple as both being the event or the things that precipitate what happens during the Passion Week. But for John, it wouldn't necessarily be that. It would just be the height of his popularity, and the Jews started to fear that he was more powerful than the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees and the sort of ecclesial ruling class. But for Palm Sunday, and it does rotate throughout the years, we look at a number of passages, and this is where I think it's worthwhile going through and reading them. So, Carrie, if you want to look up Matthew 21, verses 1 through 11. Does anyone online have their Bible with them? Glenda, if you want to do Mark 11, 1 through 11. So Carrie, your Matthew 21, 1 through 11. Mark, being with the shorter gospel, 11, this is for you, Glenda, 11, 1 through 11. Does anyone else have a Bible that wants to read? Anyone? Linda, this is going to be a long haul. So I'll have you, but 19, actually it's not really, it's a little bit. Luke 19, 28 through 44. And then, Denny, do you want to read, or do you want me to take the last one? Denny's not responding, so I will take the last one, which is John 12, 12 through 19. So I want to read these. I'm going to point out a few things, and then we'll compare them as a whole. But Carrie, nice and loud in your best public speaking voice. Why don't you read Matthew 21, 1 through 11? And here's what I'll say. Listen to the way Matthew portrays this with the eyes that he is writing to Jews.
Jesus comes to Jerusalem as a king. As they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage,
yeah.
On the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and at once you will find a donkey tied there, with her colt by her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, say that the Lord needs them, and he will send them right away." This took place to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet. "Say to daughter Zion, see, your king comes to you, gentle and riding on a donkey and on a colt, the foal of a donkey." The disciples went and did as Jesus had instructed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and placed their cloaks on them for Jesus to sit on. A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, while others cut branches from trees and spread them on the road. The crowds that went ahead of him and those that followed shouted, Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest heaven. When Jesus entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred and asked, Who is this? The crowds answered, This is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee.
So a couple things to point out there. Well, let me ask, did anyone hear anything that they want to point out before I point out things? Denny?
No, I just went and got my Bible.
Okay, just camera went to you, so I thought you were going to say something insightful.
Okay.
So a couple of things, and is that the reference to the prophets is the most pronounced in Matthew, daughter of Zion, and so they're going back to Zechariah 9:9, and it starts and it frames it that way, and because if you're writing to Jewish audience, you're saying this is the Messiah, and this was prophesied. It was like 550 years earlier. So they're reaching back into the history of Israel, into the writing of the prophets, and then so it goes from prophetic sort of references to then the commands that Jesus gave. So it establishes the precedent of the prophecy, and then Jesus is making commands. So you see some Jedi powers happening there, where he's like, go talk to these people and say, this is, we're going to take your colt. And just by virtue of we didn't have a lot of possessions back then, that no one's going to let someone walk off with their colt without a justifiable reason. And it wasn't like here's a note from Jesus, you can see it's valid, it was stamped, it was notarized, this is Jesus, we'll bring it back, here's a deposit. It's not, it's this is needed. I don't know why the colt was chosen or the proximity of it, but I always think, could you imagine being that colt, being the animal that brought the king into Jerusalem? But it's important that it says it's prophet's words, it's the commandments of Jesus and his Jedi powers, and then it's the Psalms, it's the praise, and it's and in Matthew probably more in the other than in the other Gospels, those words of Hosanna in the highest, reaching back to the time of David, reaching back to the proclamation of the same words they probably would have sang during David's inauguration or his procession into that of Hosanna. They're praising God for what's happening. Okay, so and I should say, I said this earlier, that what the word for the palms or the branches is the same for Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and that's why they're the synoptic gospels. They all borrowed from Luke probably in the language, and John deviated, but rushes. So it really doesn't have to be a palm, but the idea because not everyone had palms in that moment, and even globally celebrated, not everyone uses palms, they use some branch or some fork, but the idea is that you're putting something out to honor the king. Linda, if you want to read, I think Glenda was next.
Yeah.
Mark 11, 1 through 11.
Okay, and I am reading from a contemporary English version, so you're going to notice the language is a little different. Jesus and his disciples reached Bethphage and Bethany, near the Mount of Olives. When they were getting close to Jerusalem, Jesus sent two of them on ahead. He told them, "Go into the next village. As soon as you enter it, you will find a young donkey that has never been ridden. Untie the donkey and bring it here. If anyone asks you why you are doing that, say, 'The Lord needs it, and will soon bring it back.'" The disciples left and found the donkey tied near a door that faced the street. While they were untying it, some of the people standing there asked, "Why are you untying the donkey?" They told them what Jesus had said, and the people let them take it. The disciples led the donkey to Jesus. They put some of their clothes on its back, and Jesus got on. Many people spread clothes on the road, while others went to cut branches from the fields. In front of Jesus and behind him, people went along, shouting, "Hooray! God bless the one who comes in the name of the Lord. God bless the coming kingdom of our ancestor David. Hooray for God in heaven above." And after Jesus had gone to Jerusalem, he went into the temple and looked around at everything. But since it was already late in the day, he went back to Bethany with the 12 disciples.
So then
Substituted
what's
hooray
that?
for Hosanna.
Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah, that's notable. So this Sunday, when we'll say Palm Sunday, instead of Hosanna, we'll say hooray.
Yeah.
So what did you note difference from Matthew? Anything? Anyone?
Not really.
Well, there's no reference of the Zechariah passage.
Yeah.
You have the fulfillment of it, but you don't have a mention of it. And remember, Mark is the bare bones. Mark is the shortest gospel. Mark is the earliest written gospel. Mark is the source for much of Matthew and Luke. And so Jesus comes and commands them to go, and then you have the exchange of the donkey, and you're getting the donkey, and then he rides it, and then he goes back. It's kind of just an event unto itself. It's very factual. It doesn't claim a lot of pretense. It doesn't, but it captures the image of that's there. So again, Mark was not interested in Mark was not trying to make an argument for anything. Mark was trying to just write down the basic account. Linda, let's go to Luke 19:28 through 44.
Okay.
And you can see a couple different differences here. So particularly at the beginning and the end.
After Jesus had said this, he went on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. As he approached Bethphage and Bethany at the hill called the Mount of Olives, he sent 2 of his disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and as you enter it, you will find a colt tied there, which no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you why you are untying it, say the Lord needs it." Those who were sent ahead went and found it just as he had told them. As they were untying the colt, its owners asked them, "Why are you untying the colt?" They replied, "The Lord needs it." They brought it to Jesus, threw their cloaks on the colt, and put Jesus on it. As he went along, people spread their cloaks on the road. When he came near a place where the road goes down the Mount of Olives, the whole crowd of disciples began joyfully to praise God in loud voices for all the miracles they had seen. "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest." Some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." "I tell you," he replied, "if they keep quiet, the stones will cry out." As he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it and said, "If you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and the children within your walls. They will not leave one stone on another, because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you.
All right. So what do you hear a difference in that?
Sort of a rebuke.
It comes a little bit sterner.
Yeah.
So Jesus weeps over Jerusalem, and a passage that's often taken, but his compassion. So as he's entering and as he's beginning to have this triumphant entry, his disposition is not one of, champy hands, I'm, going in celebrating my victory. It was almost like what was being felt as a celebration by Israel, by the Jews present in Jerusalem, portrays Jesus as having this sort of somber, painful, almost sadness, and almost and very much a condemning voice. And I admittedly, despite the fact that I mean, when you read that, Linda, honestly, a little bit of today's current situation and Israel Palestine came to mind, being surrounded by your enemies, the threat of that there. But it portrays it not in the same light as the others. You get a very joyous sense of the others here by the time you're done reading Luke's account of it, which is meant to be the most historical account. So clearly along the line, some of the disciples picked up some of these themes of what Jesus was thinking. They saw him wept, and the recounting of that and led of the Holy Spirit brings that to mind. But if Luke was the only thing we would have around Palm Sunday, would you think that that would feel like a celebratory Sunday or a somber Sunday?
More somber.
So
It's
hence
more
you
of a
see
realization, I think.
what's that?
To me, it's more of a realization of what's forthcoming.
Mhm.
It's retrospective.
Yes.
And I mean, again, Luke is not necessarily written for anyone in particular. It's an account that's meant to be read aloud. But what they're doing is throughout the Luke, you see that voice pop up, the one of sort of reframing it in an apocalyptic result. And what Christ is saying is that this may seem like a celebratory time, but the result of it is one of division and one of quite frankly damnation for some. The last one, and we talked about this, that John is, although it is a narrative, contains more of the philosophical, theological aspects. In Mark and Luke, there was no mention of the prophet, Zechariah, whereas in John, you get that a little bit more. You get the instructions, you get the return to the Psalms. And so it says this, John 12 through 19. The next day, the great crowd that had come for the festival heard that Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem. They took palm branches and went out to meet him, shouting. And again, this is the only place where it has palm, uses the actual word palm. And what's interesting, is that palms in Hebrew culture are listed as one of 4 species that were acceptable for something called Sukkot, which was a celebration in the fall of I don't want to say the harvest, but around the time of the harvest. What was that? And it comes from Leviticus 23:40, which admittedly I did not look up what it says. Can you look up Leviticus 20? Yeah. Leviticus 23:40. We'll come back to that in one second. But so going on, he took palm branches and went out to meet him, shouting, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, blessed is the King of Israel. So although not a direct reference with prophetic tag to it, still reference to, that's the reference to Psalm. And then Jesus is found on a young donkey and sat on it as it is written. Now you have a direct reference to the Zechariah passage. Do you have that?
No.
Oh.
Ah, Leviticus what?
Leviticus 23.
Sorry about that.
No, it's okay.
23.
Yes. 23:40.
On the first day, you are to take the branches from luxuriant trees, from palms, willows, and other leafy trees, and rejoice before the Lord your God for 7 days.
So there you go. So and the Sukkot is a celebration of 7 days. And I don't remember what happens on it, but I know the leaves are, and they use leaves, and it's meant to be palm leaves, but it's meant to be, and it goes back to this passage that you're referencing right there. And John would have had awareness of this. Why he described it as palms over and against the other gospels, we don't know, but it's written as being palms. So both referencing the Psalm reference and the palm reference for the donkey reference in Zechariah. So verse 14, thank you, Carrie, of 12 says, Jesus found a young donkey and sat on it. And so even then they cut out the instruction of it. There's no instruction. There's no listing. John's getting straight to the point. Jesus found a young donkey, which changes the narrative altogether. I mean, like, you don't get into the Jedi stuff. You just get him walking down the street and being like, hey, look, there's a young donkey. I'm going to take this for my use. Jesus found a young donkey and sat on it, as is written, do not be afraid, daughter Zion. See your king coming seated on a donkey's colt. But John, unlike Mark and Luke, reference the Zechariah passage in a way that we don't really understand why. It is not a full reference. It doesn't even really make sense. If you were a Gentile listener, you wouldn't have got the background story from it or the prophet from it, your prophecy from it, but he does make reference to it. And then in 16, it says, at first his disciples did not understand this at all. Only after Jesus was glorified did they realize that these things had been written about him and that these things have been done. Now the crowd was with him when he called Lazarus from the tomb and raised him from the dead, continued to spread the word. Many people, because they had not heard he had performed this sign, went out to meet him. So the Pharisees said to one another, see, this is getting nowhere. Look how the whole world has gone after him. And so what you have is kind of a light reference. I mean, again, you get a bit of the popularity, you get a bit of the threat that the Pharisees felt, but you don't get the same sense of, in this, you get the Old Testament reference from Zechariah, but you don't get the same image. I think Matthew and Mark portray that sort of celebratory spirit a little bit stronger.
Jason,
Yeah.
is this the only gospel where they say King of Israel? They said earlier in John where he's the King of Israel. I didn't hear that in the other ones.
I don't remember in the very first one. Did it say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord? Is that all it says?
Yeah.
Then yeah, that's
Luke says, blessed is the king who comes in the name of the Lord.
Okay.
but again, they're both of them are still drawing back to the Davidic kingship and the line that comes through that.
Yeah.
You want a mint, Mom, to stop your cough? I always keep mints in my pocket. If you don't mind, if you don't mind a random mint out of my pocket with all the lint that comes with it, you're always welcome to one. The last biblical reference that I just want to point to, because let's see, we get Revelations 9. It comes from actually the book of Revelation, which was also written by John or Johannian disciples, but it comes from the book of Revelation 7. It should be Revelation 7, verse 9. And it says, and this is listing all the different tribes of all the different people and the multitudes that will come and basically praise Jesus. But it says this: after I looked, and therefore before me was the great multitude, and no one can count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. They were wearing white robes and were holding palm branches in their hands. And they cried out in a loud voice, salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and unto the Lamb. And goes on, angels standing and throne. And so in the end times, you have this significance of the palms being used to celebrate. So when you think of Palm Sunday, just from the basis of a biblical perspective, we don't really do a lot with the donkey, although in a lot of circumstances, in a lot of places they do. And in fact, as I talk about the history of it, they actually had a wooden statue. Oh, I printed that out. I'll have to go grab that in a second. But the idea that the palms represented, from the Jewish background, eternal life and a procession of death leading up to what Jesus was doing. From the Jewish context, palms were a celebration of a kingship, the honoring of a Davidic king that comes through. You see this humility of a donkey, and it all leads into this idea that the very thing that Israel was looking for is now happening. They don't understand it in terms of the peace, but they understand it in terms of the popularity, because although Jerusalem was still ruled by Romans, the population of Jews was massive. And so for that entire city to be celebrating this Jewish rabbi coming in and now having it connected to a 550-year-old prophecy of him riding in on a donkey, you can see what sets the stage for he's of such great power. Now the passion begins, or the torture begins. So this happens, that he goes in, and obviously Palm Sunday probably wasn't as big of we don't have a lot of record of celebration of Palm Sunday in the early church. There aren't a lot of our founding fathers or the Desert Fathers who write about it in the same way. And in fact, it really isn't until the 4th century where we start to see evidence that it actually existed. Now, as I said before, palms in the ancient Near East was a symbol of goodness, a symbol of victory, which was also, I read that it was noted, which was notable on the coins and the buildings. So palms were a significant plant, or tree, or whatever you want to call it, and they use them in the sense of goodness and victory, and it was not looked at as a negative thing in the same way that perhaps the Egyptian culture looked at it in terms of death. Solomon, in First Kings 6 through 29, Solomon carved palms on the doors of the temple. And so you have the significance of the historic aspect of it just being important to Israel. And so imagine, in the first few centuries of the church, because even John was written, as we said on Sunday, probably in 70, but it probably came into being more 90 to 110 into its final form. And as also with Revelation in the later years. But they're all drawing from this Jewish understanding of the significance of palms. And what you have is when you have the Christian empire being formed, Constantine, comes to salvation in 13, and decriminalizes in 18, holds a council in 325 to determine the Trinity. And I don't know, it was like 380 or 391, Theodosius legalizes it and makes it the official religion of the Holy Roman Empire. In that process, you have the formulation of all of a sudden a lot of stuff. They're trying to figure out what the doctrines are. They're trying to figure out what the order of the church, where they're trying to bring some sort of structure. And in the midst of that, you have a writing called the Pilgrimage of Etheria, which is all about the celebrations, a pilgrimage towards Jerusalem to celebrate and what it essentially is Palm Sunday, the entry of Jesus into Jerusalem. So from the very late 4th century, you have the establishment of rituals around it. You have writing around those rituals or those practices. And from the 4th century on, in various communities, and again, in the 5th century, you have the fall of the Roman Empire. In the 6th century, you have Gregory the Great, who revives some Christian practices through Benedictine spirituality. And then in the 7th and 8th century, you have the beginning of the formulation of that. And it was in the abbey, again, a monastic movement, in the abbey of Bobbio, of the Sacramentary in the 8th century, which is in northern Italy. You have evidence of the use of procession for this service. So sometime between the 4th century and the 8th century, you have the development of doctrine, to the extent that the notion of the procession. Now, if we were to do this in our church properly, there should be a procession of palms and sort of things, and everyone comes in and they raise the Bible up, and it's a very, and if you want to see that in more of a full form, I would say go to an Orthodox church or to a Catholic church. But you also have the blessing of the palms, and what you have during that period of the 8th century in Rome was palms were handed out and blessed outside the walls of Rome. And so they went outside it, and then they all, as a people, processed in. So you see the development of the processions that we use today, carrying palms, from the idea that they were doing the very thing that happened in Jesus's time. He was outside the walls, he was coming in, they were processing, and there were palms involved. Oh, that's what, here, hold on one second. I want to get this picture because it's worth showing you. I printed it, but I forgot to grab it. So talk amongst yourselves.
Talk amongst ourselves.
First Kings what?
I didn't hear what he said. King's what?
Okay. Me neither.
So you have these things around the 8th century and on, really for several hundred years, and they're called palm messals, and they're wooden statues. And so in the midst of them going and handing out palms, they would be polling this. And so there would be a whole procession of people waving palms, polling this Jesus on a donkey. And there's all sorts of, if you type in permesro, you get all sorts of examples. That was the one I just chose. There's some more simple ones and there's more elaborate ones. But what would happen is that outside of the towers of the entry into Rome, you had these you had boys that would sing from the windows, and they would sing a hymn that was written, or a refrain that was written in 821 by Theodulfo, what was he? A bishop. And the song, it's still in play today, called Gloria Loud and Honor, and Gloria Loud and Honor. And so the idea was that the boys were singing this up in this tower, people were processing, there was this donkey being pulled, ironically, on wheels, of a statue of Jesus. And so this when you think about what I was going, what I, when I went outside the church in this cathedral in Princeton, and you had this cantor up, this liturgist up in the tower singing out to us, and then we went and processed around. I realized at some point that this is what was happening, as a replication of what was happening in the 8th century, or attempt to replicate what was happening in the 8th century. Those practices carried on through the medieval period, and the rituals continued to develop, and they spread throughout the world. And again, we could spend a whole session talking about the various ways and the elaborate ways that Palm Sunday is celebrated. The vast majority of the non-Western, I guess in Roman Catholic circles, they've tightened up on it. Again, I said since the last century, but prior to that, and still in other countries, it's meant to be a very festive thing. It's meant to be a beautiful thing. Very elaborate crosses being raised, and there's usually, it's almost like a parade or a processional into the service. And when you think about just the majesty or the planning and the execution of that to grasp this event of Jesus's triumphant entry into Jerusalem, and the little or the lack of celebration that we have these days in some of our churches, it's sort of like a loss of this beautiful ritual. Glenda, you're going to say something?
Yes, couple of things. Why, I guess one of my questions is, why did the people all crowd around? Was it because of his miracles, or because they thought, now we have a king? And the other thing that I noticed as we were reading those 4 gospel passages, 2 of them make reference to the reaction of the Pharisees, who are kind of standing back, and they're not happy with how the crowd is paying so much honor to him. And it's like, in one of them it says, well, we can't even, the people are so excited, we can't stop this. But you really get the sense, and I don't think that becomes part of our celebration of this today, that this is really the thing, or one of the things that sets the Pharisees off on their campaign to get rid of him.
Absolutely. And almost you have to ask the question of, if his popularity hadn't reached that height, would the crucifixion in the week of the Passion happened in the same way? Was the time, like it almost like there needed to be some incentive to say it's too much, he's too powerful. And so it's kind of one of those things that's necessary. But I think it also represents the misunderstanding that the Jews, or the larger crowd of Jews, understood. They thought they were getting a king in the line of David that was going to now reign over Jerusalem, with no conception that in a matter of days, some of them would be changing their cries from Hosanna in the highest to crucify him. And not necessarily because they thought he did something wrong, but because in the face of then the Jewish authorities saying, no, he's blasphemy. He's not, he's not just claiming to be a rabbi and a teacher. And even the Messiah concept was still not like this incarnate God. It was still a human king that was chosen by God in the same way David was chosen by God. So the concept for the Jews was not that God was going to incarnate himself into the world and then come to save us and go through this process. It was that there would be an earthly king that was given power and dominion, and he would reign as David did. So for them, it was like, hey, here we go. This is it. We're leading up to this time of Passover, and this rabbi who has healed, and I mean, honestly, on the tail end of raising Lazarus from the dead. I mean, quite frankly, if we had some human figure in our world that we could conclusively see was doing miracles like raising people from the dead and healing their blind, the blind, and all the miracles that Jesus did, you might be getting behind that too, but you're like, this guy has some serious power. I'm not going to mess with him. And he must be valuable or important. But in the face of that, you see the switch of that during that Holy Week and that Passion Week, because it shows you the power of the system of the religious authorities at the time. They were still ruling body and ruling the mindsets and the understanding of spiritual expression at the time. And then those celebratory type rituals carried on again through most of the up to the 1900s, and it really wasn't until 1955 to 1969 where the Roman Catholic Church simplified the festivals to focus the whole thing on the Passion. And so again, in a lot of Catholic churches you go today, you're going to get more of a passion oriented. In fact, a lot of them, I'm sure, I think at St. Rose they do it. They read the whole Passion encounter. Now, for me, it's a little early in the week. I want that later in the week. I want Maundy Thursday and the significance for that, for what it is for us, and in terms of celebration of the Eucharist. I want that to stand before the whole Passion narrative comes in. Although I do think that mindfulness of that, which again is why we watch the movie, you can see the whole thing, and I guess that's an exercise toward that. Okay, we're sort of headed here towards the end, and some of this is stuff that again, the theological significance comes highly through symbolism in what happens. It's not only viewed as a triumphant entry, and again, the rise, the challenge, the peak, and then the Passion, and then ultimately the triumphant entry leads to the degradation, the humiliation of Christ in the crucifixion and the Passion, and then it leads to the glorification of Christ in the resurrection. And so it's a process that theologically, when we talk about the different moments in Jesus's life, the triumphant entry is the beginning of the humiliation, which then leads to the exaltation. Palms, again, have a major significant influence. One of the things that I didn't say earlier was the Greco-Roman influence was huge. When war was over, the military would turn to civilian clothing and wear togas. And the togas were decorated with palm branches. So again, going back to the idea of they won, they had goodness, they had victory, it was victorious. One of the things that has happened over the centuries and continues on in Roman Catholic and Orthodox circles around the palms is that they're blessed with holy water, and they're considered sacramental. So they're considered, so once in a Roman Catholic or a Protestant or in an Orthodox church, the day they will bless the palms with holy water, and then they're considered not to be put on the ground. They're considered to have a sacredness in the same way that they would view the communion. Not you have to consume the host and drink the wine or return to the earth because they've been blessed. So that blessing of the palms is not something that often carries on into Protestant circles because we don't bless in the same way, but it still exists in the other 2/3 of the Christian traditions. And the palms, again, as I've said before, the palms that we use on Palm Sunday, they're meant to go with us, and they're meant to remind us of this triumphant entry. So that's why when we often fold palms and little crosses, people in primarily Orthodox and Roman Catholic circles will put those in their Bible or put them in locations where they'll see them, and it's meant to be a reminder of the whole week as a whole, and a reminder of the calling that we have on our lives as followers of Christ. Theologically, the donkey echoes back to the Zechariah, and not just to say meant to be fulfillment of the prophecy, but is meant to be that upside down kingdom. It's meant to be that sense of humility, of relinquishing his life, not almost in the sense of what you would have imagined Christ coming into, but there is that divine paradoxical reversal that is thrown into the mix of it all. And it's meant to be pointing us a movement towards the cross. So Palm Sunday, in many ways, although it's meant to be a celebration for us as we do it and we celebrate here in a few weeks, it's meant to sort of orient to say, this is the beginning. We're going to celebrate one time, and now for the rest of the week, we're turning our eyes and we're moving toward that cross on Good Friday, and then ultimately towards the celebration of Resurrection Day. So in light of that, the practical ways, as we talked a little bit about the way it's celebrated, we have palm branches that we'll use, and we'll have those. As we have before, have the woven crosses, or we'll bring those into play. And those would have been, and I still have some because I wasn't here for Ash Wednesday, the Ash Wednesday ashes are made from the palms of the previous Palm Sunday. So it's meant to bring you from what's meant to be the beginning of Holy Week all the way to the beginning, to the following year of the beginning of Lent. On Ash Wednesday. And that's kind of, we'll read the narrative and we'll celebrate, and we'll call to celebration of that. And I would encourage you, all of you, on that Palm Sunday to wear red, be prepared to wave your palm. We won't have a wooden donkey and Jesus on it, but who knows? We can always maybe get a hold of something, and maybe get Louis to wear. I'm just kidding. Sacrilege, he says, so horrible. And then it's meant to be a celebration in the moment, but as we then turn to, and usually it's after the service sometime on that Palm Sunday, that I'll strip out the purple, or I'll strip out the red and put it back to purple to bring us back into the season of Lent, to remind us that we still carry on Lent all the way through Holy Saturday. So, all right, that's about it for me today. What else do anyone any questions, thoughts?
I just have one question, if you don't mind.
Yeah, of course.
The audience thought he was going to be king, or the people thought he was king. Even the disciples thought right up to the last minute he was going to be king and free them from the Romans. Did Jesus ever say that he was going to do that, or what misled all these people to think that he was going to free them from the Romans?
Just the prevailing view. I mean, that's where, Judas Iscariot, Simon the Zealot, they were all part of the Maccabean. They all had history coming out of the Maccabean revolt 150 years prior, that had this idea that the Jewish identity was central and that there would be a king. And so when Jesus shows up, claims to be this messenger from God, starts doing miracles, proclaims good news, gains in popularity. Yeah, I mean, for all intents and purposes, they're like, well, this is it. He's arrived. And again, if you saw someone doing those miracles, you wouldn't be. But this again is why last week in church, that passage from the Corinthians that talked about the foolishness of men compared to the wisdom of God was found in the divine reversal. It's flipping the narrative and saying it's not by the earthly power. It's not by anything on the earth that we obtain salvation. It's not by anything on earth that we're redeemed. It's only by the humility and by the divine granting of favor of God for no other reason than the obedience of His Son, that we have that salvation. So,
Weren't they in some respects looking for kind of a military leader?
absolutely.
I mean, they wanted somebody that was going to put together an army, kick the Romans out, and they would be restored back to it. That's kind of one thing. And he's talking about a different way, a different salvation. He's not talking about getting rid of the Romans or anything like that, like Denny says. He never's talking in those terms.
Yeah.
And then take a little play off your narrative. If he wasn't so popular and they hadn't decided then to dispose of him then, would have changed the whole narrative.
Oh, absolutely.
Then you have a whole different, so it's all sort of predetermined. To get where you're going, to get to the cross, you got to go through this.
It is, yeah.
I mean, and that's the popularity. If you think about it, here he comes in, he's a hero. To himself, he knows kind of what's happening, and it's sad. But to the population, it's very heroic. But when they take him prisoner, there is no uprising. I mean, they don't have the arms and the swords and all that kind of stuff. There's not this hue and cry of protests outside the jail, let him go, do all that sort of thing. They're still whimpering because they wanted a military guy.
Yeah.
And he's not turning out to be that. I think they look at it and then become disappointed in some respect.
Well, I mean, even up to the Last Supper, I mean, I often say, Judas, we look at him as being this person, this disciple who betrayed Christ, but Judas was not trying to get Christ crucified. Judas was trying to get Christ to open his eyes to what the role that he was supposed to play. And he thought that, I don't know if he was trying to set up a power play and hoping that, but the reason Judas committed suicide was not because he didn't get what he wanted. It was because he realized what the actions that he had perpetrated did. And ultimately, and again, it was a part of the process through which needed to happen. But absolutely, I mean, all the way up to the very end, it was this idea that there was military. So, and I think there's a lot of similar lessons we could say about where we are in Christian nationalism in our own country, that their sense of we see being Christian as being associated with power, and it's just the opposite. That the message of the gospel is always one of weakness overpowering in a much larger realm than we imagine. It's not about Christians being in power. It's not about a Christian, it's kind of like the people who always want, Hollywood or movie stars to be Christian. The minute a movie star comes out or any sport figure comes out to be a Christian, we want to highlight that and show that and portray that. Oh, look, Mark Wahlberg is a Christian, or Tim Tebow is a Christian. He takes a knee and he bows. Why? Well, that's a grab for human power. It's a grab for association. If this popular person is a Christian, so it's okay for us to be Christians as well. And it completely buys into the mindset of Jews prior to the crucifixion or prior to the Holy Week of let's grab power by what we can by human means rather than by eternal means through what God was planning.
Jason,
Yeah.
would the Jews generally have known that Zechariah passage? Because when it quotes it in the Gospels, it says, that, when he rode that donkey, that's a reference to that prophecy that says, people of Jerusalem, don't be afraid. Your king is now coming riding on a donkey. People, because he's on that donkey, do they associate that with that prophecy from long ago and therefore assume because of that donkey that he's the king?
I think that the fact that he was on the donkey was absolutely significant in the fact that you're seeing hosannas and you're seeing palms and you're seeing cloaks being laid down, because that's all Israel had. I mean, they were an occupied, in Jerusalem, they were an occupied nation. And to have all of a sudden a prophecy from over 500 years old, and then you tack on the Davidic kingdom, that's almost 1,000 years old prior to that. And the idea that this Davidic kin would come out and, you tie that all together, and they absolutely were connecting that to the Old Testament passage. And, you have mob mentality. People like to join in the party. If your neighbor's going with the cloak and some palms, you're like, hey, I want to go too. So, yeah. But it shows you the flim-flam nature of some of the. Obviously, even the disciples, even Peter's denying knowing Jesus, because none of them knew what was going on. We also look back at the whole Passion Week and we do it with this knowledge of what the end result is. But really, when you think about the Passion Week, you place yourself in the midst of the narrative without any foreknowledge of the way the narrative will end, and it gets pretty scary.
Do you think they had any concept or had in their minds that he could save himself, though? Since he had demonstrated these miracles, that he could do one of these Jedi things, so to speak, and just sort of look at him and go, you're not going to do this or whatever. And then they were disappointed when he didn't.
I think it probably again, this is me just guessing. I think it happened so fast and it was so awful and it was so out of their control. They're going from this sacred moment where their teacher just washed their feet and they shared this sacred meal, and he's talking about these symbols of, bread and wine, to go out from this meal feeling like what a holy moment, what a holy night this has been, to walk into a garden, to have all of a sudden Judas there comes up, kiss him, and guards arrest him. And the first response of Peter and the disciples are to pull swords out. They're still in that military mindset of no. And this was this was the Sanhedrin. He was being arrested on by Roman authority because of the fact that the Jews were complaining that he was blasphemous. And what the Romans at that point were afraid that if they didn't arrest him, that it was going to lead to revolt. And it was a tenuous time for the leader at the time. And that's and then he washes his hands and all that. But we'll get to that when we talk about Good Friday in a few weeks. So, all right. Any last questions, thoughts, comments?
Thanks, Jason.
So hopefully this Palm Sunday will, and I will say this week the pastors are meeting. We have, and I can't guarantee this, but we have I think historically the churches have met on Easter as our community service. I have been advocating the last 2 years that we move the community service to Palm Sunday, and allow each individual congregations to celebrate Easter in their own ways, because the Baptists are still do their own Easter service, even though there's a community service. The Roman Catholics still have a service, and it gets to the point where it feels like not truly ecumenical because we're having one service, but there's these side services. So my suggestion was let's move it to Palm Sunday. So this year, Palm Sunday may have a different flavor for everybody if we do it in a new way, which I think actually would be more celebratory and more festive as well. So I feel like Easter people go and they have their own meals, and I don't know. We'll see. We're gonna work it out tomorrow. So
Tomorrow's Thursday.
tomorrow is Thursday. All right. Any final thoughts or questions, comments? Then I will stop this, and peace be with you all this week.